on social media. Please begin preparing your hearts and your minds to receive all that would transpire before you are here today, commemorating the founding of this great institution. In this sacred and solemn occasion, I would ask that you please govern yourselves accordingly. Please stand and receive the academic profession.
Good morning. Thank you very much, Dr. Stringer, for the processional music. You may be seated. Good morning again, ladies and gentlemen, to Chairman Mfume and members of the Morgan State University Board of Regents, to our dedicated alumni, our faculty, staff, students, and all members of our Northeast Baltimore community assembled with us this morning. I welcome you to this Founders Day Convocation, marking the 152nd year in the history of Morgan State University. Happy birthday, Morgan State University. As president of this remarkable institution, I consider it among my greatest responsibilities to ensure that each year, as Morgan State University grows older, her past is never forgotten. It is extremely important to me that every student who earns a degree from Morgan will know the great Morgan story. It is extremely important that everyone affiliated with this national treasure understand its long, arduous journey and is acquainted with the hard battles fought along the way. Some of those battles, of course, were won, and some of those battles were lost, and some of those battles are still being fought today. This Founders Day Convocation will be much more sacred and far from our traditional program format. Today, we will revisit one of Morgan's growing pains of the past. It is my hope that this will be a meaningful and moving experience that will encourage each and every one of us to rededicate ourselves to the common cause of bettering our world. I implore you throughout this convocation to listen attentively to all that transpires on today's program. And so we shall begin this program officially by asking you to stand once again for the invocation to be delivered by Reverend Bernard Keels, Dean of the Morgan State University Chapel. Reverend Keels.
Shall we pray? God of every creed, faith, and people, send your grace upon us today as we embrace peace, unity, and reconciliation in this historic community. On this Founders Day, O God, pour out your Spirit upon us and ignite our commitment to community building. In our world of difference, we pray to be one people, committed to the belief that difference does not mean deficient. May we draw closer to one another, weaving the fabric of peace, unity, and reconciliation. We give thanks for our neighborhood. Gone is the history of yesterdays. There's no longer black or white, Jew or Greek, male or female, for all of we are one in the spirit of togetherness. We hear the clarion call to gather all of creation under the same community of solidarity amongst all. Let the light of life, justice, and peace guide us onward. And may your spirit of peace, unity, and reconciliation breathe on us this day, that we may discover the joy in walking together in our Northeast Baltimore community. Amen.
Okay, you may be seated. Ladies and gentlemen, we have several members of the Morgan State University Board of Regents who are joining us today. I'll ask each to stand as I introduce them. First, of course, we have the chair of the Morgan State University Board of Regents, the Honorable Kwesi Mfume. The secretary of the Morgan State University Board of Regents, the Honorable Tracy Parker Warren. Regent Winston Wilkerson, and our student regent, Mr. Jeffron Stubbs. And so I am now very pleased to present the Honorable Kwesi Mfume, Chair of the Morgan State University Board of Regents, to bring greetings on behalf of the board.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson, and good morning, everyone. Stefan, we're all wondering how you always get more applause than anyone else when you're introduced. We shall always introduce you as the student regent. That helps, right? He's great, he's effective, and students, he represents you extremely well. Thank you, Dr. Wilson, for your leadership, for your friendship, and for your stewardship of this historic university. Fellow regents, students, alumni, distinguished faculty, ladies and gentlemen, good morning again. It is my pleasure to bring you greetings on behalf of the Board of Regents here at Morgan State, as together we commemorate the founding of our institution on November 27th, 1867. Occurring as it did just 4 years after President Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation into law and abolishing what the late historian John Hope Franklin called the peculiar and cruel institution of slavery. That barely noticed yet very significant founding was also to become the threshold for the launching of a new era in all areas of life for a race of people here in America who had suffered, endured, and survived 2 centuries of slavery, oppression, deprivation, degradation, denial, and disprivilege. With that in mind, then, we hold claim to be the rightful heirs of our ancestors' legacy. For they bequeathed to us this college over 150 years ago, first as the centenary Biblical Institute of the Methodist Church, and then on to become what ultimately now is Morgan State University. We were a school of a few dollars, 20 students, but enormous hope. Moreover, as descendants of a race of people who took little but did much with it, we have learned to pause each year on this day and at this convocation to remember their heritage, their sacrifice, and their achievement. Like them, we here at Morgan bear particular witness to the radical and wholly transformational nature of education. A quest for knowledge and a passion to learn really has been the hallmark and the common denominator for 7 generations of Morgan students through this institution. And so now, a century and a half later, like you, we rejoice in having eclipsed, as we did, our sesquicentennial, and as we are moving forward now through this new century. Understandably, then, the Board of Regents here at Morgan State join with our president, with our distinguished faculty, with our alumni, and with our students in sending a warm and hearty welcome to all of you. We are particularly thankful to have with us today Stephen Ragsdale of the Baltimore Historical Society, who will be appropriately introduced shortly. So thank you all for being with us on this historic occasion. Thank you, and may God continue to bless and smile on Morgan State University. Good morning.
Thank you very much, Chairman Mfume. Today, I am excited to bring before you our keynote speaker, who will share a rarely told and largely unknown piece of Morgan's history. It is unfortunate that there are so many stories about this great institution that are unknown. If known, I am convinced that many of these stories would encourage and inspire you to achieve even greater heights in your individual journeys. I am certain that many of you were inspired after attending the movie premiere of Harriet this past weekend. While this movie heroically depicting the life of Harriet Tubman was long, long overdue, as president of Morgan, I reflected on the fact that I think so many of our students, and even some of our alumni who saw the film, might not have had an idea that there was a direct connection between that film, Harriet Tubman, and Morgan State University. Very few people who viewed this film, I am certain, were unaware that the Reverend Samuel Green, the conductor of the Underground Railroad, who aided Harriet Tubman in her initial escape from slavery, was also one of the African American founders of Morgan State University. Now, some of you might remember that I introduced Mr. Green to us during the 2017 matriculation convocation, not physically, but the trek that he had traveled out of Dorchester County, Maryland, to eventually lead those ministers here in Baltimore to do as Chairman Mfume indicated, to establish the Centenary Biblical Institute. Indeed, as you traverse around this campus, there's a brick on the quad leading to Holmes Hall, which bears Reverend Green's name. Our keynote speaker this morning will present another unknown Morgan story. I implore you to listen attentively. Today, I present to you Mr. Stephen K. Ragsdale. Mr. Ragsdale serves with distinction on the board of directors of the Baltimore City Historical Society. Now, Mr. Ragsdale is quite accomplished. His bio is printed in the program booklet, and I would encourage you to read it in its entirety. However, right now, ladies and gentlemen, I would like for you to focus and pay attention to his address and to receive yet another forgotten chapter of Morgan's history. Mr. Ragsdale lays out the events that occurred just over 100 years ago. And I want every student here in particular to remember what you have heard. Let it be inscribed in your Morgan memory. Let it return to your mind every time you might even consider skipping a class or reporting late to class or not giving your very best effort at every possible opportunity. May this story that you are about to hear, may it come to mind every time you consider an act that might disrespect the sacrifices of your Morgan ancestors, because they endured so much, because they knew that one day your life's path would lead you to this special place called a national treasure. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Mr. Stephen K. Ragsdale.
Thank you, President Wilson. Good morning, President Wilson, and other distinguished guests on the dais. Welcome all family, friends, and students of Morgan State University. When I first started researching this story, which is now turned into a book, I had no idea. Morgan was mixed up in a lawsuit, but I had no idea that the lawsuits had gone back almost 100 years. Make sure that I can. We have some slides. Am I on? Are we on, guys? I have pictures. There we go. Okay, so my story starts actually at the turn of the century when Morgan decides to move its confines. This building was located on the corner of Fulton and Edmondson Avenue. It's actually Morgan's second location. But their move prompted an organization on the other side, and everybody wasn't happy with Morgan beginning to move. But before Morgan got started, there was an active group of African Americans who organized a parade, May 19th, 1870, and it would celebrate the passage of the Voting Rights Act, the Voting Rights Bill, the 15th Amendment. The rendering behind me disguises or discuss everything that everything that Baltimore City wanted to do in its African American population. They wanted to celebrate and move forward. I'm sorry for a second. I'm very nervous because I'm in front of family and friends. I did this yesterday in front of University of Maryland. I had absolutely no problems. All right. So let me control my pace. Okay. Let me settle in, because I know this story. This story is an excellent and interesting story. Actually, Baltimore had established African-American roots all the way back to the 1600s. And these African-American citizens, mostly on the west side, had decided that they wanted to celebrate the passage of the 15th Amendment. They understood that all the rights that voting, besides voting, would bring to them. And there's a depiction of every single element of government life that they wanted to experience. They wanted to join the military. They wanted to have their marriages recognized. They wanted, more importantly, they wanted education. Education was going to be the foundation of all of their movement. The group behind me is the Mutual Brotherhood of Liberty. These black men in the 1870s, the founder at the top of is the founder of Union Baptist Church. The rest of them are lawyers, and there's one doctor in the mix. But they began to create the foundation to fight Jim Crow for the next 75 years. Because after all, in 1899, in April, in the Baltimore Sun, a writer had proclaimed that Baltimore was a white man's city. Now, there are about 2 or 3 things that lead up to Morgan's problems before the lawsuit. The first is the 1904 fire. The 1904 fire would start actually in front of the Civic Center. For those of you who know Baltimore, it would start in front of the Civic Center. It would burn all the way down Fayette Street, Baltimore Street, and then it would move north. It burned for 2 days. It would move north up Charles Street, and then winds would redirect it and blow it back down to Fayette Street, and then it would burn everything all the way to the harbor. There was more than $150 million in damages, right? That's about $3.6 billion today. There were about 1,500 acres of burned to the ground. It left 35,000 people unemployed. But more importantly, let's take a look at some pictures. More importantly, what it did was it made African Americans uninvited in the real estate game. Because what would ensue after that was this real estate land grab, right? This was a catharsis of the land. Come on, there we go. A second element in 1907 is a public health report written by social workers. This is an interesting. Not so fast. This went into African American communities. It was to take a look at slums and the descriptions of African American communities, in particular down on Hughes Street and in the Druid Hill Alley, made African American citizens look immature, amoral. They looked at their sexual proclivities. And literally, what this did was it kind of stoked up a fear factor of African Americans, in particular around public health. They were disease-ridden, and living close to them was deleterious to your personal health. This is a picture of a tuberculosis room that a kid lives in West Baltimore. Here's a picture of a public health report in Baltimore City where the epidemiologists were more or less in control. They were not treating, they were tracking how fast the disease traveled in the black community without treatment to have an understanding of the epidemiology. A third factor is, if you guys know the book Not My Neighborhood, a third factor is the passage of the first city ordinance in the country to regulate where people lived. Right? Now, this would have a steep effect on Morgan because it wasn't only the residential communities, it was also black businesses and black schools, right? And so this was passed in 1910. It would be overturned at the Supreme Court level in 1918 by Buchanan v. Worley. But not with, there was support for the bill, and the bill would be rewritten, the ordinance would be rewritten 4 times to withstand court scrutiny. And it was written by William L. Marbury, founder of Piper and Marbury, a very prominent family. I want to show you a picture of his, next slide. Okay, so facing the opposition were 2 prominent figures, 2 of which I know you know of, is John Goucher, who was president of the board back then, and John O. Spencer, who was commissioned to move the school from the West Baltimore community. He had garnered funds, $10,000, but he had a proviso that he had to raise matching funds, and he had to build a building with it. Morgan had to build a building with his name on it. Well, that's almost an undoable thing in West Baltimore and Fulton and Edmondson. And so they had to look for environs outside. I'm moving too fast. A couple other prominent figures who played well in this story is Ashby Hawkins and George W.F. Mcmechen. Everybody knows about George W.F. Mcmechen, but I think an important hero in Morgan history is Ashby Hawkins. He actually was one of the second students admitted to University of Maryland Law School. He would be expelled when the school resegregated in the 1800s. He also wrote the amicus brief to support the overturning of Buchanan v. Worley. So he was one of the first African Americans to write a Supreme Court brief. George W.F. Mcmechen actually started the whole thing when he moved into a house on McCullough Street, which was a non-integrated block. And so you have 2 Morgan students who play central, not only in housing segregation, but with how Morgan would have to proceed forward. Well, the Morgan Board, and I'm sure you guys know this history, also was involved in developing the University of Maryland Eastern Shore and the Virginia College of Industrial Institute, which was called Morgan College, and it was in Lynchburg, Virginia. Well, one of the things that happens is Morgan is forced into this paradigm of looking for a lot of different spaces behind this law, right? And so President Spencer would look at literally 50 different sites before he would look for a space. Actually, Morgan wasn't supposed to be here first. Morgan was actually planned for corner in Park Heights community. on Slade Avenue in Park Heights, right across the street from the new suburban golf club that was built 3 years earlier. Well, Park Heights was loaded with a lot of real estate investors. Remember that 1904 story? You know, they bought in. Well, there were lots of opposition. They wanted to build on the James E. Ingram property. James Ingram was a lawyer who existed in Baltimore County in the 1700s. But after his passage, the land was open, right? I mean, and literally, Park Heights at that part in time was actually part of Baltimore City. Protests argued against that. And it wasn't just Park Heights, it was every surrounding community, Sudsbrook, all of the communities that were out in the Park Heights area. They would be, let's see. This is one of my favorite slides because in the Sun protests, literally, let me back up. But in the Sun protests, when they litigated the case, they actually listed every single board member by name so they would know what was going on and who was involved and who was supporting the Morgan efforts. And this was an all-white board. Morgan would actually file the Park Heights would actually file an injunction and stop Morgan from building out in the Park Heights community. Morgan would have to search for another environment. Like one of the things that I found during this time period, and I always like to talk about the zeitgeist of Baltimore, is this is around the same time that two prominent Johns Hopkins figures come into play. Thomas Dixon. Do you guys know who Thomas Dixon is? Thomas Dixon actually wrote, I'm backing up, I'm moving backwards. He wrote Birth of a Nation when he was a Hopkins student. Woodrow Wilson was raised to become the President of the United States, President of Princeton University, but prior to that, actually had a friendship with Thomas Dixon and invited him to show the film Birth of a Nation. And it would be the first time that a movie would be shown in the White House in 1915. Two prominent figures who fought against this was William F. Trotter, who started the Guardian newspaper, one of the first African-American newspapers in the country, and W.B. Du Bois, who was a frequent visitor of Baltimore. William F. Trotter would actually visit the White House and have conversations with Wilson about stemming the tide of this film. So Morgan cannot build in the Northwest, and so they have to look at other places. And they find this little plot of land in Northeast Baltimore. And there you can see, there's an old map, and there's the Ivy Mill property. And one of the things that astounds me in this is look who owns property out here. Elizabeth John Garrett property, A.S. Abel. You know, these were prominent figures in Baltimore history, very wealthy men. But they were opening up the real estate out here, right? I mean, so Montebello Park and Laurelville was becoming a large community. One of the things I like about Laurelville, like I grew up in Laurelville, was one of the things is when you look at old Laurelville, this is a picture from 1911. This is like a current picture. That's the same house. The neighborhood hasn't changed in over 100 years very much. This is a block that I grew up on, Grindon and Whitesell Avenue. Let's back up. That's the old cemetery. This picture that zoomed by really fast was actually the first schoolhouse. It's on the corner of Whitesell and Grindon. But this is a 1911 picture of the same space, and you can see that it hasn't changed very much at all. Folks were very proud of the neighborhood. And so prior to Morgan moving out here, editorials would appear in the Sun paper because folks were getting wind that this school was coming, but they couldn't stop it. Morgan would sign a deed in April 1917, and at the same time, Laurelville and other surrounding communities were planning indignation meetings. Another element that kind of forced Morgan's board into into conflict was this debate went to Annapolis, and so there would be 3 different bills to go to Annapolis, and the first was literally to prevent Morgan from building on land that it had already purchased. August Seaford is actually a popular photographer back then. One of the things that Larville said was they wanted to maintain the sanctity of an all-white community, right? And so August Seaford, in my discovery, showed that in Larville there were black people, who actually lived on the property, on this side of the property, on Morgan's property. There's a black church here. A lot of the folks who live around here who mine the quarry. Heron is known for its quarry stone, and so black people in the neighborhood, they just don't own. The complainants, although there were many, they raised literally what would be considered millions of dollars to kind of, in today's dollars, to fight against this effort. But there were actually only 4 couples who would join the suit. And again, the suit is to protect the sanctity of an all-white community, right? And there are, every community literally above Clifton Park, all the way as far west as Bel Air Road, the Bel Air Road community, was actually against Morgan building here. The Long Island Association, the Larville Improvement Association president would state emphatically that he would prefer to live near a community of ignorant and tractable Negroes than one of educated Negroes. I mean, so like, and one of the articles that I find early on, and you don't hear much of it during this debate, is they're actually agitated that Morgan is planning, or they hear that Morgan is planning to build a residential community behind the university. The folks who participated in the lawsuit who would hear the case is Judge Frank Duncan, who's a very curious judge in Maryland history. But I want to call attention to Edgar Allan Poe, who's a descendant of the great poet Edgar Allan Poe. But because he was a rock star. Captain of the Princeton football team. For all you guys who follow college football, you know that Princeton and Rutgers played in the first college football game, and that's being celebrated right now. So playing that for Princeton back then gives him rock star status when he comes back to Baltimore. He's a Baltimore City solicitor. He's the state's attorney. But Morgan had its own rock star team. Towson lawyer, George Brody, John Mayer Little. These are from a Towson firm. These were strong Republican outfits. So Morgan had some capital to do battle, but they did it quietly. When Morgan set aside moving, this group is out here. They have to port themselves, this large group has to port themselves all the way over to what is now the edge of Edmondson Village. And so they are serious, right? They would litigate the case in the paper. See, sue to block Negro colony. Women groups, auxiliary groups, everybody was against Morgan being in this community. However, the Morgan board stayed extraordinarily quiet over this. This thing would take place from 1913 to about 1917, 1918. This is the number of articles that I found from the Morgan side. 1, 2, 3, 4. That's it. And so they stayed mum on the, even when interviewed by the Baltimore Sun, and the Baltimore Sun was a little slanted. I found that WB, just back then, not casting judgment now, But W.B. Du Bois lived in this town for almost a dozen years, and there's no record of the Baltimore Sun ever interviewing him. There are letters of opposition that come in from every neighborhood association, businesses, and some of these businesses still exist in Baltimore today. And then there are letters from Laurelville. The letters are an interesting read, and hopefully I'll make them part of my book. Now, there's also letters of support that come in for Morgan. It's usually the black luminaries. Come on now. John Goucher kept incredible files on this lawsuit. Like, he had lots of correspondence with Baltimore City and the state, and he logged them in. Like, literally every opposition letter that John Goucher came in, he had a form letter that he would amend, but he answered, he responded to every single one of them. Here's the second bill that's introduced in the legislature. And it's introduced in the special session. And it's to remedy ill feelings between the races. So, like, again, the third bill would state emphatically that it would move to prevent black people from buying property in Baltimore County. And that's it. That's the title of the bill, a measure to protect ill feeling between the races. Now, that's the old Morgan College. It was in Virginia, in Lynchburg, Virginia. And one of the things that happens is that college actually burns down in 1917, mysteriously. There's no water to be found to fight the fire, and so, like, literally the Morgan board has to figure out, like, what to do next. And they take this population of Virginian Morganites, right, and they quietly move them onto this campus. Right? Now, that would have a profound effect because essentially Laurelville citizens were living amongst black people for quite a period of time. And so the third time that Spencer went, he would have to defend himself in front of the Maryland legislature. And Edgar Allan Poe would go on and actually use up almost all of the time allotted. He would only leave President Spencer about 15 minutes to speak. President Spencer sat quietly and waited his turn, right? But when he stepped to the podium, he said, "You have a problem? You think these people are going to be problematic? Well, have you heard anything recently? Has there been any problems recently?" Well, no. Well, these students have been living amongst them. Drop the mic. The case is over. The second plot of land was sold to Morgan by a guy who was originally part of the protest. He had given money. I know, money talks. But it would be June 18, 1918, and that's all of the land below what is now Cold Spring Lane. And so the first property is above Cold Spring Lane, and this is what it looked like. I found some beautiful pictures. As mentioned, as stipulated by the grant, Carnegie Building would be the first building erected, right? And I found some old postcards, but they would repurpose some of the old buildings on campus and use them. The fear from the community was that Morgan would go beyond its charter. Well, this is what they were arguing legally, that Morgan was going beyond its charter by building communities. Well, the courts found that Morgan and the Commission of Education could do far more things than just teach reading and writing, right? They could build buildings, they could erect. And so built 145 houses because in a strictly segregated city, if placing a school out here, this was miles away from the closest black residential community. And so they would construct 145 houses back here. W.B. Du Bois would live in this community for, like I said, for about a dozen years. He would have his daughter, Yolanda, in this city, right, who taught at my alma mater, Dunbar Senior High School, right? And so many prominent figures would fall through Baltimore. I love my pictures of Martin Luther King traveling through the Morgan Park community. And so we were one of the first middle-class black communities established in the entire country. Another, and I found this story most recently, is Harry O'Neill Wilson. Anybody ever heard of Harry O'Neill Wilson? He was actually one of the Baltimore's, he is Baltimore's, they called him a genius. He was a financial genius in the early 1900s. He was an African American who starts out illiterate. He would start at 3 companies and would start like banks. He would finance white hotels. But one of the things that he did was after Morgan won the lawsuit, he bought a plot of land right up Cold Spring Lane and named it after himself, called Wilson Park. So Wilson Park will be established the same year that Morgan Park, making them some of the, and so if you know anything about like redlining and all that, these were what they considered like blue label communities. These were well-to-do. One of the reasons that they favored these communities, the bankers favored these communities, were not only that they were loaded with people like the folks on the dais, but they were homogenous communities in a segregated town. And with that, thank you.
We can do a little bit better than that. Come on, let's please thank Mr. Ragsdale for taking us down that very, very important historical path. Once again, thank you, Mr. Ragsdale, for that poignant look into our past. Throughout the history of our great nation, as you pointed out in your presentation this morning, racism has been a terrible monster that has raised its ugly head whenever the opportunity presented itself. And what today's convocation, what makes it so special is that we are deliberately revisiting one of the unfortunate chapters in our history. However, we do that with a commitment to turn the page. We are committing with our partners in this ceremony to turning the page on racism, to turning the page on social injustice, to turning the page on discrimination, to turning the page on hate. We are here to begin a new chapter in this history, which begins, we think, with peace, it begins with unity, and it begins with reconciliation. And so I am now going to invite to the stage Mrs. Sandy Crider. She is the immediate past president of the Laurelville Improvement Association, and it was under Mrs. Crider's leadership that the idea for today's program was conceived. And so please join me in welcoming Ms. Sandy Crider as she comes to the stage.
Good morning. Thank you, Dr. Wilson and Dr. Johnson, for inviting me to give a response to today's presentation. It's an honor to be part of this convocation. Mr. Ragsdale's presentation was very impactful due to the events that had occurred. When he presented on this topic at the February 2019 meeting of the Lorville Improvement Association, or LIA, a powerful visual strongly affected me. The fact that original source documents he displayed as part of his presentation, hateful letters written over 100 years ago by the LIA, were on the same letterhead that was still in use until a couple of years ago. After Mr. Ragsdale's presentation that night, Jennifer Yuckna, then Vice President, and I talked about initiating some form of apology to Morgan and to Morgan Park. When Dr. Johnson reached out to us about participating in this peace, unity, and reconciliation event, we were happy to bring this proposal to the membership of the LIA at our May meeting. The motion to participate passed with overwhelming support. My own journey to this moment started about 1 year ago when, as president of the LIA, I suggested to our board that we have a local history presentation at our February meeting. Board member Marla Arrington immediately suggested a Black History Month presentation, and Marietta Mills right away suggested we invite Stephen Ragsdale to speak about the historic relationship between Morgan College, Morgan Park, and Lorville. Happily, Mr. Ragsdale agreed and gave his presentation to members of the LIA, Morgan Park Improvement Association neighbors, and other area friends and residents. Lorville is a different place today than it was at the time of Morgan College's relocation to this area. It is now a diverse community where 54% of residents are African American. Lorville neighbors of different races and backgrounds live amicably side by side. Today, as we celebrate our commitment to peace, unity, and reconciliation within our Northeast Baltimore communities, I believe it is very important to look forward to the work we must continue to do here at home and out in the world, to confront our implicit biases and dismantle institutional impediments that must be overcome to improve the lives of those who have been harmed by systemic disenfranchisement. I encourage everyone to participate in this fight for justice. I will close with a quote from Congressman John Lewis's November 2013 speech to the Jewish Community Relations Bureau in Kansas City. Not one of us can rest, be happy, be at home, be at peace with ourselves until we end hatred and division. Thank you.
Is a disgusting, rat and rodent infested mess. If he spent more time in Baltimore, maybe he could help clean up this very dangerous and filthy place. No human being would want to live there. That no human would want to live there. You know who did? I did. From the day I was brought home from the hospital to the day I left for college. And a lot of people I care about still do. There are challenges, no doubt, but people are proud of their community. I don't want to sound self-righteous, but people get up and go to work there. They care for their families there. They love their children who pledge allegiance to the flag. They are Americans too.
Those people are living in hell in Baltimore.
when the violent storms of injustice began to rage, we need peace. When there are those who seek to build walls to separate us, we need peace. When we forget that we are all brothers and sisters in one human family, regardless of race, religion, culture, sexual orientation, or nationality, we need peace. We need peace.
I am not a stranger to the dark. Hide away, they say, 'cause we don't want your broken parts. I've learned to be ashamed of all my scars. Run away, they say, no one will love you as you are. But I won't let them break me down to dust. I know that there's a place for us, for we are glorious. When the sharpest words wanna cut me down, gonna send a flood, gonna drown my mouth. I am brave and I am bruised, and I am who I'm meant to be. This is me. Look out, 'cause here I come. gonna send a flood, I'm gonna drown them out. Oh, I am brave and I am bruised, and I am who I'm meant to be. This is me. Look out, 'cause here I come, and I'm marching on to the beat that I drum. I'm not scared to be seen, and I make no apology. This is me. Oh, oh, this is me.
Today, we are reminded of the division that once existed between Morgan State University and its surrounding communities more than a century ago. That division was largely rooted in racism and social injustice, as you heard me say earlier. In recent months, it seems that there have been veiled efforts to take us back to a place of injustice, to encourage division, and to discourage unity. But today, in this historic moment, in this sacred space, we remember the past only to forever put its negative acts behind us. Today, we come together in peace. We come together in unity. We come together in reconciliation. Before this crowd of witnesses, we declare that we are indeed one Northeast Baltimore community. Let me say that again. We declare that we are one Northeast Baltimore community. We are united in purpose, we are united in progress, and we are united in promise. We have with us today a host of leaders from all over Northeast Baltimore City who are representing their respective communities and standing with us in the name of peace and reconciliation. We also have with us scores of our student leaders to participate in this moment with us, and I'm going to have them to stand and be recognized. Thank you. Mr. Marshall. Please direct the community leaders and neighborhood representatives to join us in the name of peace, unity, and reconciliation.
Your willingness to be here today is a testament to your commitment to peace, unity, and reconciliation in our beloved city. Ladies and gentlemen seated in the audience, as your community or your neighborhood is announced, if you are indeed in agreement with peace in our city, please stand, come to the stage, be recognized as your community is announced. Representing the Baltimore City Assistant State's Attorney, Ms. Janie Thames, class of 12, Ms. Morgan State University, 2011-2012. Representing the 3rd District Police, Sergeant Hardy. The 3rd District Councilman, Ryan Dorsey. Rita Cruz, class of 76, President of the Bel Air Edison Community Association. Jazani Johnson, 91, social worker, the Gardenville Elementary School. Ann Yastrzemski, the president of the Gidim-Belhar Community Association. Mike Hilliard, executive director of the Harbell Community Association and a Morgan State University professor of social work. Paula Provines, president, Hillen Road Improvement Association. Mercedes Unfried, president of the Laurelville Improvement Association. Malik Mosley Sr., 88, president of the Lock Raven Improvement Association. Rebecca Hackett, the Perring Lock Community Association. Ms. Lorna Hanley, 97, principal of the Montebello Elementary School. John Harris, vice president, Moravia Walter Improvement Association. Valencia Baker, president, the Morgan Park Improvement Association. Mr. Keon Grayson, president of the Morgan State University Student Government Association. Mr. Janie Thames, of the Morgan Park Improvement Association. Senator Mary Washington, District 43 of Maryland. Mr. Brandon Holmes, the Vice President of the Morgan State University Student Government Association. Michael LaChance, Vice President, North Harpert Road Community Association. And the reason, ladies and gentlemen, why this is so important, Mr. Lois Parto, 6th grade student, St. Francis of Assisi School. We'd like to acknowledge Jasmine Kine, a representative of the Mayor's Office of Baltimore City. We'd also like to acknowledge Mr. Harry Spikes from the late Congressman Cummings' office, who is here.
I would ask that each of you now light your candle as an indication of your commitment to peace, your commitment to unity, and your commitment to reconciliation. As we stand united holding these candles, which represent our respective communities, let us be reminded that there is indeed a bright light that lives within each and every one of us assembled here today. Today, we stand as one Northeast Baltimore community, and we proudly declare that we stand for peace, that we stand for unity, that we stand for reconciliation in our beloved city of Baltimore, and we will unapologetically let our lights shine. Let there be peace among us. Let there be unity between us. Let the pain of our past be reconciled, and let it forever remind us that division has no place, ladies and gentlemen, in our future. So as we come to the end of our program, let us please welcome musical performing and recording, artist and former Miss Morgan State University 1997-98, Navaja Deya. She is escorted by our current reigning Mr. and Miss Morgan State, Munley Julian and Erica Knox. She will lead us in the singing of the alma mater, followed by Reverend Keels, who will give the benediction, who will be assisted by Imam Derek Amon, Reverend Dr. Florence Ledger, and Rabbi Eton Mintz. And after the benediction, please remain standing at your seats until the platform party and the faculty have exited the concert hall. Ms. Deya.
future may bring. And thus our devotion, fidelity to, and homage we pay as we sing. Fair Morgan, as onward the years quickly fly, and thou livest in memory sweet, we bring thee our laurels, whatever they be, and lay them with joy at thy feet. We pledge thee our love, we pledge thee our faith, whatever the future may bring. We will the devotion, fidelity to, and homage we pay as we sing.
Let us pray.
There are many ways. There are many ways to be unfaithful to what we have become, to our commitment and our obedience to our neighbors and to our Creator. We offer to one another our prayers, patience, and understanding.
We confess to you, living God, our failure to live as sisters and brothers and as your children.
We have not loved you and one another as you have loved us.
We confess to you that we have doubted your word and failed to obey your teachings to love our neighbors as we love ourselves.
We confess to you our desire to live in our own cultural, racial, and ethnic maps, seemingly oblivious to the theology and anthropology of others.
We confess to you, in a world of difference, we have only looked through a lens of conformity. Transform us, O God. Return to our neighbors and our friends in the spirit of unity, reconciliation, and justice.
Across the barriers that divide us, race from race.
Reconcile us, O God.
Across the barriers that divide neighborhoods.
Reconcile us, O God.
Across the barriers that divide rich from poor.
Reconcile us, O God.
Across the barriers that divide faith and beliefs.
Reconcile us, O God.
Confront our comfort zones, our hidden prejudices and fears that denies and betrays our human condition.
Reconcile us, O God.
Enable us to see the causes of strife and misunderstanding. Remove from us all superiority. Teach us to grow in unity with all of humankind.
Reconcile us, O God. Know that God is the great weaver, who from the loom of diverse human experiences weaves a human fabric of many colors, textures, shapes, sizes. Together, all of we are one, creating that one beautiful work of art that we call humanity. Go in peace.